Most people think success begins with opportunity, but for Sarah it began with heartbreak. One cold night her husband walked out the door and left her with nothing, no money, no job, no plan, just a small apartment and a 5-year-old daughter sleeping in the next room. Imagine waking up the next morning realizing the life you built for years disappeared overnight. That was Sarah's reality. The fridge was almost empty, the rent was due in 2 weeks, and the only thing she had left was the responsibility of protecting her little girl from a world that suddenly felt very uncertain. During the day she tried to act strong for her daughter, but every night when the apartment became quiet she wondered the same terrifying question: how do you rebuild a life when everything falls apart? But what no one knew was that inside that tiny apartment something unexpected was about to begin, something that would slowly transform a struggling single mother into the owner of $1 million business. The same woman people once ignored, the same woman who worked exhausting night shifts at a diner just to survive, was about to prove something powerful to the world. Because sometimes the moment that breaks your life is the exact moment that builds your future. And Sarah's story is proof that losing everything might be the beginning of something far greater than anyone ever imagined. My name is Sarah, and the day my husband walked out of the door was the day my entire world changed. I remember the cold silence in the apartment as I stood there holding my 5-year-old daughter Emily in my arms, trying to understand how a life that once felt so stable could fall apart in a single moment. The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed in the empty hallway like a final answer to every question I had been afraid to ask. For years I believed our life was normal. We were not rich, but we had enough to survive. My husband worked at a construction company, and I stayed home taking care of Emily, cooking dinner, and trying to make our small apartment feel warm and happy. Every morning I woke up early, packed his lunch, kissed him goodbye, and believed that we were building a future together. But slowly things began to change. He started coming home later than usual. Sometimes he did not come home at all. When I asked him if something was wrong, he would only say he was tired from work. I wanted to believe him because believing the truth felt too painful. One evening he sat at the kitchen table without even looking at me. His voice was cold and distant. When he finally spoke, he said, "Sarah, I cannot do this anymore." I thought he meant he was tired from work or stressed about money. But then he stood up, grabbed his jacket, and said he was leaving. He said he wanted a different life, and he was done pretending to be happy. I stood there, frozen, while Emily played quietly on the floor with her toys. She did not understand what was happening, but I did. My heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. I asked him, "What about Emily? What about our family?" But he only shook his head and walked toward the door. The last thing he said was, "Take care of yourself, Sarah." Then he left and never looked back. That night I sat on the couch holding Emily while she slept in my arms. I stared at the wall, wondering how I was going to survive. The rent was due in 2 weeks, and the small savings we had in the bank would not last long. I had no job, no degree, and no idea where to start. The next morning reality hit harder than anything I had ever experienced. I opened the refrigerator and saw only a few eggs and half a carton of milk. I realized that I could not sit there crying anymore, because Emily needed me. She needed food, she needed safety, and she needed hope even when I felt completely lost. So I got dressed, woke Emily up, and walked her to the small daycare down the street. I told the owner that I was looking for work and asked if she knew anyone who was hiring. She gave me a kind smile and said the diner on Maple Street was looking for a night waitress. I had never worked in a diner before, but I knew I had no choice. That same afternoon I walked into the diner with shaking hands. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, and people were talking loudly at the tables behind me. A middle-aged man named Mike owned the place. He looked at me for a moment and asked if I had experience. I told him the truth. I said no, but I promised I would work harder than anyone he had ever hired. Maybe he saw the desperation in my eyes, or maybe he just believed in giving people a chance. But he nodded and said, "You can start tonight." That night became the beginning of the hardest chapter of my life. I worked from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, carrying heavy plates, cleaning tables, and smiling at customers, even when my feet felt like they were burning. When my shift ended, I would quietly walk back to my apartment, pick Emily up from the neighbor who watched her while I worked, and then sit in the dark wondering if life would ever get better. Many people who came into the diner did not notice me at all. To them, I was just another waitress bringing coffee and refilling water glasses. But every night while I worked, I kept thinking about Emily. I kept telling myself that I could not let this be the end of our story. I did not know how yet, but somewhere deep inside me a small voice kept whispering that my life was not over. It was only beginning in a way I never expected. The next few weeks of my life felt like a long dark tunnel with no clear end. Every day followed the same exhausting routine. I woke up early to make breakfast for Emily, then walked her to daycare before coming back to the apartment that suddenly felt too quiet and too empty. Sometimes I would sit at the small kitchen table staring at the wall, remembering the life I once had and wondering how everything disappeared so quickly. But I knew I could not stay trapped in those thoughts for long because by evening I had to return to the diner and work another long shift. The diner on Maple Street was always busy. The sound of plates clinking, coffee machines humming, and people talking filled the air from the moment the doors opened until late at night. At first I felt nervous around the other workers, because most of them had years of experience while I was still learning how to balance 3 plates in my hands without dropping them. But slowly I started getting better. I learned how to greet customers with a warm smile, even when I felt completely exhausted inside. Some nights were harder than others. There were customers who complained about small things like cold coffee or slow service, and sometimes their words felt like sharp knives cutting through the little confidence I had left. But there were also kind people who left generous tips and thanked me for my work. Those small moments of kindness reminded me that not everyone in the world was cruel. One night while I was wiping a table near the window, an elderly woman called me over. She had been quietly watching me work for almost an hour. When I came closer, she smiled gently and said, "You look like someone carrying a heavy weight on your shoulders." I tried to laugh it off, but something in her voice made my eyes fill with tears. I told her a little about my situation, about how my husband left, and how I was trying to take care of Emily on my own. The woman listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached into her purse and handed me a $20 bill. I immediately tried to refuse, but she shook her head and said, "This is not charity, this is belief." She said, "Sometimes life breaks us to show us how strong we really are." Her words stayed in my mind long after she left the diner. That night when I returned home, I looked at Emily sleeping peacefully and realized that I could not spend the rest of my life just surviving. I wanted something more for her. I wanted her to grow up seeing her mother as someone who never gave up no matter how hard life became. A few days later, something happened that quietly changed the direction of my life. During a slow moment at the diner, 2 women sat at a nearby table talking about their small businesses. One of them said she had started making handmade candles in her kitchen and selling them online. She talked about how people loved unique handmade products and how social media helped her reach customers across the country. I tried not to stare, but every word they said caught my attention. When they finally left the diner, their conversation kept repeating in my mind like a small echo that refused to disappear. That night after my shift ended, I walked home feeling more curious than usual. Emily was already asleep when I arrived, so I quietly sat down at the kitchen table and opened my old laptop. The computer was slow and the screen flickered, but it still worked. I typed a simple question into the search bar: how to start a candle business. Within seconds, dozens of videos appeared on the screen. I clicked the first one and began watching. A woman on the video explained how she started making candles from simple materials: wax jars, fragrance oils, and cotton wicks. She showed how a small hobby could turn into a real business if a person stayed patient and consistent. I watched another video, and then another. Soon hours passed without me noticing. For the first time in months, my mind was not focused on fear or sadness. It was focused on possibility. The idea of creating something with my own hands felt strangely exciting. I imagined sitting in my kitchen pouring melted wax into glass jars while soft music played in the background. I imagined labeling each candle carefully and sending them to customers who might enjoy the warm glow in their homes. The more I thought about it, the more the idea began to feel real. Of course, doubts quickly followed. I had almost no money. I had never run a business before, and I barely had time between taking care of Emily and working at the diner. But deep inside my heart, another voice spoke louder than the doubts. It reminded me that doing nothing would keep my life exactly the same. I looked around my small apartment and realized that even though it was simple, it was still a place where new beginnings could happen. The next morning, I decided to take a small step. During my lunch break at the diner, I walked to a nearby store and bought the cheapest candle-making supplies I could find: a small bag of wax, a few cotton wicks, and 2 simple glass jars. When I held the bag in my hands, it did not feel like much, but to me it felt like the first brick in a future I was trying to build. Later that night, after Emily fell asleep, I carefully melted the wax in a small pot on the stove. The warm scent filled the kitchen. As I slowly poured the liquid into the jars, my hands trembled slightly because I was afraid of making a mistake. But when the candles finally cooled and hardened, I felt a small wave of pride wash over me. They were not perfect, but they were mine. I placed the 2 candles on the table and stared at them for a long moment, wondering if anyone in the world would ever want to buy something made by a tired waitress working late at night in a tiny apartment. But instead of letting that doubt stop me, I opened my laptop again and began learning how to sell products online. As the night grew quiet and the city outside my window fell asleep, I realized that something inside me was changing. The pain of being abandoned was slowly turning into determination. I was no longer just trying to survive. I was beginning to dream again. And sometimes a simple dream is the first step toward building a completely different life that no one else believed was possible except the person brave enough to try. The next morning, When I woke up, the first thing I saw on the table were the 2 candles I had made the night before. They were simple and not perfectly shaped, but to me they looked like the beginning of something new. Emily ran into the kitchen rubbing her sleepy eyes, and when she saw the candles she smiled and asked if they were for her. I laughed softly and told her they were the first candles I had ever made. She clapped her hands with excitement as if they were the most beautiful candles in the world. In that small moment, I realized something important. Sometimes the biggest support we receive comes from the smallest hearts. That morning, after taking Emily to daycare, I felt a strange mix of nervousness and excitement. I kept thinking about the candles and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, someone out there would want to buy them. My shift at the diner felt longer than usual that day because my mind was full of ideas. I kept imagining different scents, colors, and designs every time I poured coffee for a customer or carried plates to a table. My thoughts drifted back to the tiny kitchen in my apartment where my 2 candles were waiting. When my shift finally ended late that night, I hurried home as quickly as I could. Emily was already asleep, so I quietly sat at the table, turned on my laptop, and began researching again. I learned about simple websites where people could sell handmade items. I read stories about people who started with nothing and slowly built successful small businesses from their homes. Some of the stories sounded almost impossible, but they also gave me courage. If they could do it, maybe I could too. After a few hours, I created a small online page for my candles. I spent a long time thinking about what to call them. Finally, I chose the name Second Light because that was exactly what these candles represented to me: a second chance, a second beginning. After taking a few photos of the candles with my phone, I uploaded them to the page and wrote a short description explaining that they were handmade with care in a small kitchen by a mother who believed in never giving up. When I clicked the button to publish the page, my heart started beating faster. It felt like I had just stepped onto a road that I could not turn back from. The next few days were quiet and uncertain. I checked the page again and again, hoping to see a message or an order, but nothing appeared. At first I felt disappointed, but I reminded myself that every journey begins slowly. So each night after work, I continued making more candles. I experimented with different scents using small bottles of fragrance oil that I bought from the store. Vanilla, lavender, and cinnamon became my first 3 scents. The apartment slowly filled with warm, comforting smells, and even though the process was simple, it made me feel proud. Emily loved watching me work. She would sit at the table carefully placing stickers on the jars while asking 1,000 curious questions. Sometimes she would say, "Mom, when you become rich, can we buy a big house with a swing in the backyard?" Her words made me smile, but they also reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. One evening, something unexpected happened. A notification appeared on my laptop screen. Someone had placed an order for 2 candles. I stared at the screen for a moment, thinking it might be a mistake, but it was real. A woman from another state had bought my vanilla candles. The excitement that rushed through my chest was impossible to describe. I felt like shouting with joy, but instead I covered my mouth and whispered thank you to the quiet room around me. The next morning, I carefully wrapped the candles in soft paper, placed them in a small box, and wrote a thank you note by hand. When I carried the package to the post office, it felt like I was sending a small piece of hope out into the world. Days turned into weeks, and slowly more orders began appearing. They were not many, but each one felt like a victory. Sometimes customers sent messages saying they loved the scent or the warm glow of the candle in their homes. Those simple words gave me strength on the nights when my body felt too tired to continue. Balancing 2 lives, working long hours at the diner and building a tiny business in the quiet hours of the night. But the journey was far from easy. There were days when the wax spilled or the candles did not set properly. There were nights when I felt so exhausted that I wondered if all the effort was worth it. Yet every time I looked at Emily sleeping peacefully in her bed, I remembered that giving up was not an option. Slowly, without realizing it, my small kitchen project began turning into something real. The table that once held only 2 candles now held dozens of jars waiting to be packed. The shelves in the apartment started filling with supplies and boxes. Sometimes I would stand in the middle of the room looking at everything in disbelief, remembering the night when I made my first 2 candles with trembling hands. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I decided to share a short video of my story. I recorded a simple clip showing how I made the candles and briefly explained that I was a single mother trying to build a better future for my daughter. I did not expect many people to see it, but I posted the video anyway and went to sleep that night without thinking much about it. The next morning, when I woke up, my phone would not stop vibrating. Messages, notifications, and comments kept appearing on the screen. When I opened the video, my heart nearly stopped. Thousands of people had watched it during the night. Some left kind words of encouragement, while others shared the video with their friends for the first time. Since my husband left, I felt something powerful rising inside me, a feeling that maybe the world was finally beginning to notice the quiet fight I had been fighting every single day. And in that moment, standing in my small kitchen surrounded by candles and hope, I realized that the life I once thought was over was slowly transforming into something far greater than I had ever imagined.